Hi everyone, Fran here on Alan History Nerd. This video is relevant to AQA A-Level History Unit 2J, and what I'm going to go through in this video is key individuals more relevant to the first year of the course and what we could say about them if they were to appear in a source in the America exam. Just a quick word of warning, there may be somebody who appears on your exam in a source who is not on this PowerPoint. That might be because they are more predominant in the second year of the course, and I'm going to do a separate video on those people, but it also might be because you are not meant to know who they are to begin with. And a good example of that was in 2018, we had a source by Mrs. Chestnut who does not appear on this PowerPoint. In that case, you will be given some information about the individual, and from there will be lots that you will be able to say about them. Let's get to it then. So these individuals are going to be put into a rough chronological order in terms of where they first appear in the course. So we're going to start with James Tallmadge. He worked in the House of Representatives. He's from New York, which is a northern state that has pro-Southern sympathies. He's famous for proposing the Tallmadge Amendment, named after him, during the Missouri Compromise. This amendment will ultimately pass in the House of Representatives where there is a Northern majority, but fail to pass in the Senate because you've got the Southerners who vote against it, but also 5 Northern senators. Next, we've got one of the more famous people in the America course, Henry Clay. He's a Whig, he's from Kentucky, which is a border state, and he will serve in the House of Representatives and the Senate. He plays a key role in multiple events, namely the Missouri Compromise, Nullification Crisis, and 1850 Compromise. He will try and become president on 4 occasions. On 3 of those occasions, he'll actually win the Whig nomination, but on all 4 attempts, he will never actually become president of the United States. And then he does die in 1852, which is a couple of years after the 1850 Compromise. On to another very famous individual in the America course. John Calhoun is a Democrat from South Carolina, a very famous extreme southern state. He's central in the nullification crisis, but he is quite prominent in the source section of the America exam because he did so many speeches and wrote so many works. And I've put a few examples of the works he does, and you can see the date runs from nullification crisis but down to 1850, which is the year he dies. There is a speech that he writes in opposition to the compromise, but he won't actually say it because he is too ill. The next few individuals are relevant to westward expansion and in particular the Mexican War. We're going to start with John O'Sullivan because he coined the term Manifest Destiny in 1845, and you could quite easily get part of that document that he wrote where he uses the term Manifest Destiny in the exam. He's an American columnist, he's an advocate for the Democrats, and interestingly, when it gets to the Civil War, he will essentially become an active supporter of the Confederacy and write a number of pamphlets supporting the Confederate cause. So he could also appear in a source a lot later down the line. So it's just good to know where he fits into that story. Here we've got the first president that we're going to look at in this video. So James Polk is elected in 1844 and will serve from 1845 to 49. Please remember with presidents that they tend to be elected in the November of one year, but then inaugurated in generally the January of the following year. Hence why you've got the 44, but then the 45. Polk is famously known for expanding America through the Mexican-American War. We get the annexation of Texas and the Mexican secession land, but we also see America expand, taking what will become Oregon, splitting it at the 49th parallel with Britain. Now we've got the first abolitionist of this video, William Lloyd Garrison. He's a Christian abolitionist from Massachusetts, which is a northern state. He's best known for his newspaper, The Liberator, which will start being published in 1831 in Boston, which is in Massachusetts, and it'll run through until 1865. Sam Houston is an individual people tend to forget about, so he's quite important to go over in this PowerPoint. He is an American general and politician, born in Tennessee, which is a southern state, but will settle in Texas in 1832. He is pivotal in the Texan Revolution of 36 and 37, and he will lead the American Texans to victory in the Battle of San Jacinto. He does have a lot of political positions across his career, so he's the first and third president of the Republic of Texas when it's independent. He's one of the 2 first senators for Texas. He's the governor of Tennessee and the 7th governor of Texas. He's one of the few individuals to have been a governor of 2 different states. David Wilmot is a politician. He's a Democrat from Pennsylvania, which is a northern state. He is most famous in our course for the Wilmot Proviso, which he creates, where he essentially says that any land gained from the Mexican War should not have slavery, and he's doing this in opposition to Polk's pro-Southern bias. I've put an exclamation point on the next bit. Please remember he's not an abolitionist. His motivation was not ending slavery. It's attacking Polk's pro-Southern bias. Wilmot later down the line will become a Republican, just in case you are Googling him, but do remember if you're looking at the Wilmot Proviso in 1846, he is a Democrat at that point. Winfield Scott is an American military commander and politician. He was from Virginia, which is a southern slave state, but he will remain loyal to the Union in the American Civil War. Prior to the war, he's involved in the Mexican War, taking the capital, Mexico City, and he will then go on to play a role in the American Civil War, developing the Anaconda Plan. He does, however, resign from the Union Army in 1861. He does try and become president at various points in the course, namely 1840, 44 and 48. He will win the nomination in 1852, but will not be elected president, and instead, as we will see soon, Franklin Pierce was elected. The next individual, Kearney, is again relevant to the Mexican War, hence why he's placed here. So he's an American colonel, famous for his role in the Mexican War. He is famous for his role in New Mexico, taking Santa Fe, and is also famous for his role in the conquest of California. John Fremont crops up in a few places on this course, but the starting point is the Mexican War, hence why he's here now. So he's originally from Georgia, which is a southern state, but he is an opponent of slavery, which is quite interesting, quite unique. He was an explorer, and he also works in the military, so he'll have a role in California, being taken control of in the Mexican War. He's also one of the first 2 senators of California. He does also appear in a different part of the course, which is the rise of the Republican Party, because in 1856 he is the first nominee for President of the United States under the Republican Party. He will, however, be defeated and not win the presidency. James Buchanan will win instead. At the beginning of the Civil War, he's given command of a department in the West by Lincoln, but essentially what he does is he issues an unauthorized emancipation edict and has to lose his job. He is relieved of his command by Lincoln for insubordination. Santa Anna is a Mexican individual that we study. He was a politician and general. He refused to accept Texan independence following the Texan Revolution of 1836 and 7. He's therefore also important in the Mexican War. And what is interesting, he also crops up later in the course in 1853 because of his involvement in the Gadsden Purchase. On to our next president in this video. Zachary Taylor is born into a prominent family of plantation owners, and he is a Whig. Very famous for his role in the Mexican War. He is involved at the incident at the Rio Grande, and he's also involved in the Battle of Buena Vista, so very famous in the Mexican War, but also is important a little bit later down the line, because after the Mexican War he is convinced, reluctantly, to run for president in 1848 and will win. Despite being a southern slaveholder, he doesn't push to expand slavery and does want harmony. That's his priority. To avoid the issue of slavery, he will urge settlers in New Mexico and California to bypass the territorial stage of applying for statehood and jump straight to drafting a constitution, and that will really set the scene for the 1850 Compromise. At that point, we've finished the individuals who are closely connected to westward expansion in the Mexican War, so we're going to start looking at people who are connected to the 1850 Compromise. Daniel Webster was a Northern Whig from Massachusetts, which is a northern state, and he is famous for his 7th of March speech in which he spoke in favour of the 1850 Compromise. At this point, you may want to watch Alan's video where he analyses this source because it has come up on the America exam before. William Seward's really interesting because he's an abolitionist from New York, even though his father was a farmer and owned slaves. He makes a very famous speech in the middle of the debates of the 1850 Compromise called Higher Law Speech. So he is against the compromise, on taking an abolitionist stance in terms of his justification. What's interesting is he's going to be prominent across the rest of the course, really. So he did his best to try and stop the southern states seceding, but he will devote himself to the Union, and he serves as Secretary of State under Lincoln from 1861, and he'll go through actually past Lincoln to 1869. In 1850, Zachary Taylor died, and his vice president, Millard Filmore, took over. So he is also a Whig, but from New York, which is a northern state. He supports the 1850 Compromise, unlike Zachary Taylor, and pushes Congress to pass it. Because he supported the 1850 Compromise, he does feel like he needs to make sure that the Fugitive Slave Act was enforced, and this did damage his popularity. In 1852, we've got the next presidential election. He will fail to win the nomination, but in 1856, he will win the nomination for the Know-Nothing Party and run then, but he will not win the presidency. James Buchanan will win it. Stephen Douglas is a very famous individual who first appears as part of the 1850 Compromise, where he breaks down Henry Clay's Omnibus Bill into 5 separate laws, and is a big reason in why the 1850 Compromise will end up passing. Having said that, he is very famous in many other events that we look at. So he is behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He goes up against Lincoln and wins in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And in the debates, we'll see his Freeport Doctrine idea come forward. And he's also going to be key in the split of the Democrat Party in the 1860 Democrat conventions. He will also run for president in 1860 as the Northern Democratic candidate. At that point, the key individuals who come up during the 1850 Compromise have done, so we're moving on a bit chronologically. So Salmon P. Chase was initially a Whig, will become a Republican later down the line from Ohio, which is a northern state. In the aftermath of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he is an individual who does play a role in the origins of the Republican Party forming. He will run for president in 1860, but Abraham Lincoln will be chosen instead, and therefore Chase takes up the role of Secretary of Treasury. He will do that job from 1861 till 1864, where he will resign, but at that point he will be nominated by Lincoln to go on to the Supreme Court. At this point, I've put the case of Anthony Burns in this video because he's a good example of how some Northerners reacted to the Fugitive Slave Act. So Anthony Burns was an African American who'd escaped from slavery, but as a consequence of the stricter Fugitive Slave Act, he was captured and put on trial in Boston. His trial saw people of Boston storm the courthouse, and federal troops were used in the city to ensure that Burns was ultimately transported back into slavery. So it's a good example of how, in some instances, Northerners reacted very aggressively to the new stricter Fugitive Slave Act. Eventually, his freedom would be bought, and he would go on to get his education and become a Baptist preacher, and would move up into Canada, where he would work there. Next, we have a famous abolitionist from the course, Harriet Beecher Stowe. She's an author, very famous for writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. She is connected to the Beecher family, which are famous for their involvement, her dad in particular, for his role in the Second Great Awakening. On this slide, I have put some facts about Uncle Tom's Cabin in terms of its sales, its reactions, so you can get a bit of a feel for the impact that her work had. Next, we've got President Franklin Pierce, elected in 1852 and serving from 53 to 87. He's a Northern Democrat. He's from New Hampshire, which is a northern state, but he is not an abolitionist. He believed abolitionism was a threat to the unity of America. His presidency is famous for quite a few things: the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the sort of aftermath of the new stricter fugitive slave law being passed through the 1850 Compromise, but also over topics such as the Gadsden Purchase and issues to do with Cuba, including the Ostend Manifesto. Talking of the Gadsden Purchase, we've now got James Gadsden. He's an American diplomat. In Pierce's presidency, he is US Minister to Mexico. He is from South Carolina, and that does come out in some of the views that he has. He is involved in the Gadsden Purchase, which is named after him, which is land bought by America from Mexico. Then thinking about the Ostend Manifesto, we've got Pierre Soule, who has a key role in that event. So he's born in France, but moves to America and lives in New Orleans, which is in the South. He's a Democrat. He does have a few political positions. The one that we need to know about most is that he is the US Minister to Spain between 1853 and 55. He's famous for writing the Ostend Manifesto, which was an attempt to gain support for basically America annexing Cuba. Thinking about 1856 then, so after Gadsden Purchase, after Ostend Manifesto, we've got quite another famous event, the beating of Charles Sumner, which happens in 1856 by Preston Brooks, almost beaten to death on the floor of the Senate. Charles Sumner is interesting. He is a senator from Massachusetts, he's a northerner, but is relevant in the first and second year of this course. So he will go on to be a radical Republican who will criticise Lincoln for being too moderate on the North, and he will be, generally speaking, quite a famous radical Republican that we study in the second year. At this point, it's right to mention Preston Brooks, who is the individual who beat Sumner in 1856. So he's an American politician, he's a Democrat from South Carolina, he's a strong advocate of slavery and states' rights, and he is famous for attacking Charles Sumner in 1856. He will die unexpectedly in 1857, so he comes up in the beating of Sumner, but we don't study him too much beyond that event. On to a president I have named a couple of times already, James Buchanan. He was elected in 1856 and served from 57 until 61. He's a Democrat from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a northern state, but he is an advocate for states' rights, in particular regarding slavery. So again, this notion again that not all Northerners are abolitionists. There are quite a few things that happen in President Buchanan's presidency. So he intervenes in the Dred Scott case, very controversial. He accepted Southern attempts to engineer Kansas's entry into the Union as a slave state under the Lecompton Constitution. He supports Breckenridge's unsuccessful candidacy in 1860 at the offset of the Democrat conventions. And what's quite interesting, is very famous for his behaviour and actions after Lincoln's elected. So this period called the lame duck period, which is after Lincoln's been elected but before he's been inaugurated. James Buchanan has been criticised heavily for his behaviour in that period. He's seen as angering the North by not stopping secession, but also angering the South by not really yielding to their demands, so doing what they want. So he kind of is not very popular on both sides there. In terms of individuals who appear during the Buchanan presidency, the most famous is Dred Scott. He was an enslaved African American who would sue for his freedom and that of his families after residing in a free territory and a free state. He's therefore connected to the very famous Supreme Court ruling of Dred Scott versus Sanford. He will die in 1858, so we look at his case, we look at the backdrop of his case and his life. But after the Dred Scott ruling, we don't do too much about Dred Scott as an individual because he will pass away the year after. Directly connected to Dred Scott is Justice Taney, who was the Chief Justice on the Supreme Court at the time of the Dred Scott ruling. So he's a Democrat. He's born into a wealthy slave-earning family in Maryland. He will deliver the majority opinion in Dred Scott versus Sanford, ruling that African Americans could not be considered citizens and that Congress could not prohibit slavery in the US territories. Following from Dred Scott, one big event that we look at is the Lincoln-Douglas debates. I thought Lincoln would be perfectly positioned here. So he was a moderate Republican from Illinois, which is a northern state. He's most famous for being President of the United States, elected in 1860, serving for that term. He's elected in 1864 for a second term, but then assassinated in 1865. I have just put him here because of the Lincoln-Douglas debate. So you need to know Lincoln for his role in the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858. His role in the election, his role as president in the war, but then into second year, you also need to know about his Reconstruction policy, namely the 10% plan, but also his role in the 13th Amendment. We're going to move on to William Yancey now because we've already covered Stephen Douglas as part of the Lincoln-Douglas debate, so we're going to shift now towards 1860. So William Yancey was pivotal in Southern secession. He's a Democrat from Alabama. He's a fire eater. What's interesting, he's not always had extreme views in the sense that he didn't support Calhoun during the nullification crisis. It's in the 1830s and into the 40s that his mindset will shift, and we see him gaining more extreme views in terms of secession. He's most famous in terms of where we study him for the 1860 Democrat Convention. He will be instrumental in splitting the party into a northern and southern faction. He will walk out with other fire eaters. In the Civil War, he's appointed by Jefferson Davis to head a diplomatic delegation to Europe. He's not successful. He becomes quite frustrated, and eventually he will end up working in the Senate for the Confederacy. He will die, however, before the end of the Civil War in July 1863. Linking into the Democrat conventions, we've got John Breckenridge. He will emerge as the Southern Democratic nominee in the 1860 election. He won't win the election, that will be Abraham Lincoln, but he's very important for sort of his role in the 1860 election. He is from Kentucky, which is a border state, and in the Civil War he joined the Confederacy and will fight in the war actually in battles such as Shiloh, which is what we study in 1862. Another candidate in the 1860 election is John Bell. He runs for the Constitutional Unionist Party. He's from Tennessee, so he's a Southerner. He's got quite a big background in politics. I've put some bullet points of what he does politically prior to 1860. He won't win again the 1860 election. That will be Abraham Lincoln. He will ultimately, when war breaks out, abandon the Union cause and support the Confederacy. If we shift now following the 1860 election, because we have covered the 4 candidates, Stephen Douglas, Lincoln, Breckenridge and Bell. So the election happens, Lincoln wins, and then you get the first wave of secession. A very crucial individual who emerges at that point is Jefferson Davis. He had served in the Mexican War, he's got military experience, and he had also worked in politics representing Mississippi. He's actually also got a background in slavery. He had operated a large cotton plantation with 113 slaves. So he will be the president for the Confederacy, even though he was against secession in 1858. When it push comes to shove, so to speak, he will end up being obviously the Confederate president. He is obviously the only Confederate president because the Confederate States of America will lose the American Civil War. The last event we look at is Fort Sumter, so just a couple of individuals who are relevant to that event. So we've got Robert Anderson. He is the Union general who had been given command of forces in and around Charleston, South Carolina, which is why he's relevant to Fort Sumter. And then we've got Beauregard, who was a Confederate general officer who started the American Civil War in many senses by leading the attack on Fort Sumter. Trained in military and civil engineering, he had fought in the Mexican War like many of the people we've looked at today. He commanded the defences of Charleston, South Carolina, which is why he then becomes involved in Fort Sumter, but he is also involved in a lot of famous battles that we look at. So First Bull Run, for example, is one that he's involved in. He will hold, ultimately, several key commands in the Western Theatre.
Huge thank you for Fran for that really useful video together. Just again to reinforce what she said, it is obviously helpful if you've got a key figure used in one of the sources and you've got this kind of extra background information to use about them, can really help with you talk about provenance. But it is quite likely there might be a source from a figure that you don't know and couldn't possibly be expected to know about, in which case there will be plenty of stuff in the attribution or other things about the provenance that you can really get your teeth into. So big thank you again for Fran for another excellent video. Please hit like to show your appreciation for her work and ask any questions or any comments in the comments section. If you haven't subscribed to Alan History Nerd already, then please do so. There's loads more on this unit, on other history units, and also on A-level politics. And we've also embarked into the exciting world of TikTok. So check us out on there as well. Thank you very much for watching.